So thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar on accelerating Europe's power decarbonization, planning, procurement, and contracting. My name is Kasparos Bokas. I'm the director of the electricity program here at Clean Air Task Force. Clean Air Task Force, or CATF, as we're sometimes known, is a global nonprofit and advocacy organization that works to accelerate solutions and strategies needed to achieve a zero-emission, high-energy planet at an affordable cost. We are a global organization. We work at the EU and member state levels in Europe, in addition to the US, Africa, and the Middle East. So I'm very pleased today to have with me Fabienne Roch and Charles Berrigan from Compass Lexicon's energy practice to be presenting their findings of their upcoming report on enhancing Europe's power planning and procurement and contracting. After the presentation, we'll take a few audience questions if we have time, before moving on to a panel discussion with Annegret Grobel, the president of the Council of European Energy Regulators, and Georg Zachman, senior fellow at Bruegel and HCB. So as we all know, and as the Draghi report pointed out, since 2019, EU energy price levels and volatility have soared well above other nations, challenging competitiveness. And while emissions have significantly fallen over the last decades, deployment rates of clean energy must accelerate rapidly to achieve future targets. So in this year, 2025, all eyes are on the European Union to start delivering on its transformational plans. The Clean Industrial Deal and the Action Plan for Affordable Energy aims to enhance Europe's competitiveness and reduce electricity prices while also advancing decarbonization and re-industrialization. So this is why CATF thought it would be timely to commission a report by Compass on the needs and solutions for accelerating the deployment of clean energy technologies, specifically for electricity, to reliably decarbonize Europe. I think this report by Compass can help inform European policymakers as they are working on the grid package and the white paper on deeper electricity market integration. And so I'm very pleased to call upon Fabienne and Charles to the webinar now to present their upcoming report. Over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Kasparas, for the introduction and for the good cooperation with the Clean Air Task Force on this study. What we are going to do with Charles is present to you the key findings of our report in the next 20 minutes or so. Perhaps to start with the context for this study to add to what Kasparas said. Fundamentally, we think, at a critical juncture in terms of market design at EU level. In the first 2 decades after liberalization, there was a focus on, I would say, a set of patches overlaying the energy-only market, so support mechanism for renewables. Then we had the implementation in the past decade of capacity mechanism for security of supply. But a lot of that has been, I would say, non-coordinated and not thought through as a structured and coordinated framework that would interact with the market in a mutually enhancing way, as opposed to a way that would simply address some gaps in a patchy way. So what we think is that the 2024 energy market design reform is actually a turning point, in the sense that it puts forward planning mechanisms, for instance, establishing an assessment of the needs for flexibility alongside adequacy and grids, as a stepping stone towards a well-functioning energy market. And it also includes, as a structural part of the market, some of the, I would say, long-term contracting. So there's been lots of discussion on PPAs. on CFDs, on CRMs. And this is hopefully no longer a set of, as I said, uncoordinated measures. But the next challenge is to not only create that common energy market, but also coordinate, in our view, these other sets of instruments that are overlaid onto the market. So that's really the starting point. And our mandate in this study with the Clean Air Task Force has been to investigate in greater details how a better coordination of these planning mechanisms in the first stage, and then a much more coordinated approach for contracting, so long-term contracts of various types, could work hand in hand with a better functioning integrated energy market to deliver our objectives, our policy objectives, both in terms of decarbonisation, security of supply, and affordability. So that's the context and mandate. Turning to the next slide, fundamentally, to conceptualize what I just mentioned, a lot of the focus, both in the academic and practitioners' debate, has been on the competition in the market. That's the last part of the sequence that you see here. What do I mean by competition in the market? Well, creating a set of, I would say, energy trading arrangements across Europe and making sure that they are harmonized and coordinated and integrated. And we've had the different steps towards integration, first of their head energy markets, market coupling, then all of the balancing and reserves markets with the platforms. So there's been a lot of focus, and there is still focus, and it is needed, on improving that competition in the market. We are, for instance, going to move to 15 minutes increments as opposed to 1 hour for a good part of Europe in the fall, and that's another step in improving the granularity and coordination of our energy markets. But the focus actually of our report is not on this essential part of the market. It's actually on what is before, as I said, the planning of the system needs and the contracting, so the competition for the market and the procurement framework. And we feel, the report is addressing a gap in the literature. There are obviously lots of studies on specific issues. But what we try in this report is to have a comprehensive review of how these planning and contracting stages can be further enhanced and coordinated. And we call that hybrid markets because there is a key role in having this last step, which is a competition in the market, of course, but it's also recognizing the essential role of these first two steps in delivering an efficient framework for Europe's decarbonisation, security of supply, and competitiveness. That being said, let's turn to the first step, planning. So what is the issue with planning? Well, fundamentally, the issue is that we have a lot of planning mechanisms in Europe, but A, they are not coordinated, and B, they are not necessarily, I would say, fit for purpose. So on the lack of coordination, just an example, we have a planning mechanism for networks, the 10-year development plans. So as the name suggests, it's looking at 10 years. It's not looking at 2040 or 2050. And it is done by TSOs based on scenarios. We have a separate assessment for adequacy, which is the ERA framework that's been coordinated. The energy market reform from 2024 is asking TSOs and ESA to develop a framework for flexibility assessments. But again, this is a set of patchy planning mechanisms which are not synchronized, which are very often not consistent in their assumptions and approaches, which are lacking a vision of, I would say, the full value chain, in the sense that the demand side And the electrification of the, I would say, end uses is going to be essential in these planning processes. And it's also lacking very often a cross-sector perspective, although there is progress between ENTSO-E and ENTSO-G. Now, what are the possible solutions? Well, first and foremost, we need more policy alignment as a precondition. And an example you see on the slide is the different countries' NECP, so National Energy and Climate Plans, pledges regarding renewables targets. And you see that if you identify the pledges made and compare that to what would be necessary to reach the EU level target, we have the vast majority of countries being short. So that shows that the sum of all of the individual commitments does not equal what is needed as an EU level. And we have a lack of alignment and coordination at the policy level, even on the targets. So that should be the starting point. Then obviously, it's not just about targets, it's about implementation. And let's start with methodologies, maybe on the next slide. So how do we do our planning? Well, we do it with a set of different methodologies, as we've discussed. And we think that there need to be a much more comprehensive approach on the one hand side, and an approach that is also much more granular. So if I start with the left-hand side, we need to plan and establish the need for different things that are going to be critical for the system. So for instance, firmness, flexibility, grid services. The Spanish blackout is still under investigation, so it's too early to draw conclusion, but it does show that we are actually lacking information. And probably that's a lesson for all of us in terms also of planning. Are we, looking at the right things when we look at adequacy? Well, there was no shortage of adequacy, and still we had a blackout. So we probably need to improve our methodologies for assessing what is needed in the system in order to maintain security of supply. We also need to account for extreme system shocks. So with extreme events becoming more frequent with climate change, we need to plan not for the average climate year, but we need to plan for the extreme events. We also need to have a holistic approach, because very often the assessments that are done in the power sector assume some flexibility from the gas sector or hydrogen sector and vice versa, but without cross-checking either the commercial viability of these business models or that simply the regulatory approach would allow this to work. So more is needed on the methodologies. And if I move to the next slide, we have a number of recommendations very concretely. So if you take a look at the right-hand side, for instance, we suggest that the different countries' scenarios, which are in the national energy climate plans, should be reconciled with the EU agenda. There could be a system of peer review. There could be a system of cross-checks. But that would reinforce essentially the credibility of these scenarios, and that would harmonize them in one way or another. We also strongly suggest that the adequacy and flexibility assessments going forward should be coordinated. So we have taken a good number of years to coordinate the approach for adequacy. It's still not perfect. Hopefully we can be quicker for flexibility and do that in an integrated way. When it comes to infrastructure, I mentioned networks and the fact that this is largely a separate process at the moment. We think that this should be broadened to other types of critical infrastructure, including on the hydrogen side or on the clean gas side, or I would say downstream in the value chain, charging for EVs, for instance. A lot of these issues should be included in some of the planning exercises. And what that requires fundamentally is also some thinking on the governance of the planning. And this is where it's not just a question of who does the planning, but with what inputs from the various stakeholders, with what I would say incentives and process to ensure the viability of these assessments. So that raises a number of governance questions on the planning side. I suggest we move on to the next stage, which is the procurement. So on the procurement side, so it's essentially a set of long-term contracts here, and there are very different types of long-term contracts. But if I look at renewables, we have historically had, feed-in tariffs, feed-in premiums, renewable certificates, and we have CFDs. Fundamentally, we had an image that this would disappear, and we now see them as being a structural part of the market. Why is that? Well, because I think we have realized that in the transition, there are a number of issues with the deployment of these technologies. For instance, cannibalization of revenues. If you are not deploying flexible resources at the same time and to the scale required, with the growth of renewables, then you have a drop in captured prices, and that may undermine the profitability of merchant investment. You may also have a drop in utilization of batteries if you build too many of them of the same type or don't diversify. So there is an issue of missing money bracket. There is an issue of risk as well. So investment de-risking is part of the story. And finally, there is an issue of coordination. These contracting mechanisms are also what I would call a commitment device. Contracts and markets are mechanisms to coordinate stakeholders. And where markets may not be always the perfect tool in terms of coordination, contracts can provide an additional mechanism to do so. Now, moving on, I'm perhaps handing over to Charles to walk us through our specific recommendations. And I think you start with PPAs, Charles.
Yes, hello everyone. So indeed, when we talk about hybrid markets, it doesn't mean a fully centralized procurement process. There could be a mixture of different forms of contracting processes, reaching the different targets and objectives and system needs. And that's also been the choice in Europe with the EMD. So the first part would be to rely on private contracting to develop some of these technologies and to answer to some of our needs. The issue is, so far, there's still a number of barriers to develop those contracts in Europe, even though these barriers are slightly or progressively being removed. There's still some issues with regard to counterparty risks that limit the possibilities for clients to be able to enter into such contracts. There's also questions around the balancing or shaping risks of these contracts, because there might be some difference between what the generation side could do and what is the needs of the buyers of these contracts. And therefore, there's a need to reconcile the shapes of the generation to the shapes of the needs. There's also questions around transaction costs in a very decentralized market. This could lead to inefficiencies and difficulties for some of the parties to meet their counterparties, and therefore ways to reduce those transaction costs would be needed to try and expand this market. There could be restrictions with regard to public purchase rules and the fact that some of the public entities may not be able to commit to long-term contracts, for instance, which may limit also the use of private contracts. And there's also a question around awareness and interests. So a few suggestions we've developed in this report is to try and facilitate the development of PPAs and private contracts in general, is standardize and simplify the PPA design and the trading arrangement. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to have the same PPAs and the same contract design and the same products, but it means that through more standardization, some market participants that today cannot go in the PPA market because it's too complex could then use those standards to more easily enter the market and to be able to contract in a safer way for them and an easy way for them. So that's one aspect. Again, it doesn't mean that very sophisticated buyers cannot rely on more specific PPAs arrangements. The second point is to try and stimulate the demand of PPA And one of the aspects I mentioned just before is by allowing public entities that are consuming significant shares of energies to actually go into PPA. So some of the public procurement rules may need to be tweaked or to facilitate them to enter into PPAs. The third point is to develop shaping products and associated markets to allow for market participants to mitigate the risks, whether on the generation side or on the buying side, and to be able to bridge the gap between what generation can do and what are the needs of the buyers. There's different ways to do that, but these projects should emerge in order to try and address those needs. One way to also reduce transaction cost, but also to be able to better align supply and demand is potentially through a facilitator organized marketplace that could help meeting or matching demand and supply for PPAs. It wouldn't be a mandatory marketplace, but it will allow for, especially for small clients, for instance, to more easily find counterparty and sign PPAs with other parties on the supply side. And the last point is potentially working on the aggregations of different types of sources, of energy sources, renewable energy sources in particular, together with flexible assets to be able to create bundled PPAs, to combine this with more effective tracking of origin, to be able to respond, for instance, to requirements from some buyers to go towards 24/7 clean energy, and to also exploit the synergies between those types of assets and be able to also shape products and to better address the need from the demand side. So that's the one part, is really looking at the private contracts. The second part is looking at the public contracts. The EMD advocate for some form of standardization of these public contracts around the design of contract for difference or similar types of products. The issue is with a traditional contract for difference design. So what I mean by traditional is really a mechanism which is based on, which has the reference price as the spot price, for instance, and that any deviation from this is compensated through the premium or conversely. If you have very standard kind of a contract for difference, it can raise a series of issues. The first one is it can distort any dispatch incentives. So renewables may have incentive to produce when there's negative prices, but other types of technologies that may have some flexibilities and could respond better to the short-term price signal may also have lower incentive to actually respond to those prices. The second thing is, if you imagine a world where there's a massive penetration of renewables under such CFD contracts, there might be a risk of drawing out liquidity from the forward market. And they may need to be to think about a way to make sure that we don't just draw out all this liquidity from the forward market, and therefore we can play with the referencing of the CFD to make sure that we don't lose liquidity in other markets. There might be also issues related to how to allocate efficiently risks between the developers on one side, the consumer on the other side. There could be also questions about what is the impact of these CFDs on the price signals on the consumer side, and especially on the end consumer side, and also questions on how we can ensure there's efficient interactions between the private long-term contracts and the public long-term contract, and avoiding there is any forms of crowding out effects from one contract to the other. So the EMD is harmonizing the types of contracts to be used for these public tenders, so the CFD, but there's still a lot of discussions and room for improvements on how we can specifically design those contracts in a way that try and address these key design issues. Just to give a few examples of the types of contractual recommendations we can make. First, there could be ways to improve the contractual design and incentive provided by these contract for difference, trying to address some of the issues I mentioned before. And to do that, there could be, it could mean to leave some degree of price exposure when we define the reference index for or the strike price for the CFDs. So that's one solution. And the second solution is to try and decorrelate the CFD settlement from the actual generation, which means that you may have incentive, or you may have remuneration which is independent, or to a certain extent independent from your actual generation, and therefore it means that you can manage your generation in a most efficient way as according to the price signals in the market. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is to play around the procurement and making sure you have an efficient procurement. The general principle is to resort to competitive tendering processes, looking at prices as a main criteria, to ensure that you can get the cheapest resources to address your need. But in some cases, you may also need to encompass additional criteria to make sure that you can meet other objectives that might not be directly linked to prices. If you want to do that in an efficient way, it is very important to make sure that you can provide ex ante the rules for procurement and the objectives you will be looking at, and to make sure that these criteria are objective, measurable, and quantifiable metrics, so that you can build trust in the procurement process. And when you design this procurement process, the entity needs to have an adequate mandate and incentive to make sure that this procurement is done efficiently and as according to this objective and measurable matrix. The third kind of pillar of this procurement process is security of supply. So we've talked about mostly clean energy supply, but one of the important aspects is also to make sure that addressing our needs, we ensure security of supply. What the AMD has done is basically enshrining the role of capacity remuneration mechanisms in maintaining the adequacy. And the AMD is also pointing towards the issue of flexibility and the need to recognize in the design of markets the value of flexibility. Today's situations in Europe is that there is a patchwork of approaches to ensure security of supply and contract flexibility. There's not yet a common vision on whether to implement those mechanisms and what should be the best mechanisms, and which leads to potentially no level playing field across Europe, interfaces issues, difficulties to have cross-border participation in those mechanisms, even though we are in an internal integrated market. And therefore, some of the recommendations we made in this report is first trying to expand and harmonize these mechanisms. They need to be adapted to the needs of the system, and these needs may vary across regions. But we think that when you look at certain areas of Europe, certain regions of Europe, these needs can be well aligned, and therefore it could militate for the implementation of region-wide CRMs. These mechanisms should be market-based, and technology neutral as much as possible to ensure the most efficient procurement. Technology neutral doesn't mean that it needs to be exactly the same products for everyone. It needs also to be adapted to different technologies and different lead times. It's very important to bear in mind that a consumer providing demand response may not be able to commit 4 years in advance, whereas on the contrary, some technologies need to have this lead time, this period to be able to actually build the assets. It could be 4 years for some technologies. It could even be more when we think about, for instance, pump storage or nuclear generation. You need to have much more lead time. Therefore, we need to find ways in the design of these mechanisms to address those aspects, and these mechanisms should be future-proof, and that means also that they needs to look at the design of the product, combining adequacy but also flexibility. There might be different ways to do this, but the idea is really to try and ensure that you have good coordination between the procurement of flexibility needs and adequacy needs, and making sure that there is a right efficiency in the procurement of these products, especially because usually a lot of these capacities can provide at the same time flexibility and adequacy, and therefore it's very important to have an efficient procurement for these bundled or these products. Maybe to continue, I'll pass you the floor, Fabien.
Yeah, wrap up. This is our last slide, and then we'll finish. So fundamentally, we also think that there is increasingly an issue with market design downstream, in the sense that end users of electricity, who are also, those electrifying, both in industry, in the transport sector, in buildings, have a need for very often predictability over their energy costs. And what we think is that the thinking on the role of these contracting mechanisms needs to be extended to think about the needs of these end users. So there are a number of initiatives promoting 24/7 clean power procurement. We won't go into the details here, but let us highlight some of the key points. The first thing to say is that, of course, when you have a producer and a buyer, some of the interests of these parties may not be aligned. And this is where having a third party in the game, a contracting entity that can be state-backed, is also a way potentially to enhance the risk allocation and therefore to unlock sometimes a situation that on a bilateral basis may be challenging. And we see indeed in Europe many schemes emerging, which are three-way schemes in terms of contracting, where there is an off-taker, an industrial off-taker, there is a producer of clean energy, but there's also often a third party, an intermediate that is taking some of the risk, for instance, some of the balancing or shaping risk, or providing, I would say, a timing matching if the downstream user does not want to commit long-term, but medium-term, whilst upstream for the financing of the clean production, there is a longer-term commitment. So that timing mismatch can also be managed by the central entity. So we have more research going on this topic, but I think it's time to stop here to leave time for the discussion with Annegret and Gord. So back to you, Kasparas, and thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Fabienne and Charles, for that presentation. So I'd like to call Annegret and Georg back on Zoom to start our panel discussion. So first, kind of very, very open question to you, Annegret. We've heard a lot on both planning, procurement, contracting, and even market design during this presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to get your perspective on which of these overall gaps and reforms resonate the most with you, and where do you see the most potential, especially in the next couple of years, with some of the policy reform opportunities that are coming down the line?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, and thanks for the very interesting presentation. I agree with a lot of things about, for example, saying that the different planning tools like TYNDP, ERA, and you name it, need to be more aligned with regard to the assumptions, to the methodologies, etc. And we are trying hard also with ACER as regulators to bring this more into shape and to align it more. And I think that is an important aspect of the planning. Where I, however, have still a bit of, let's say, reservations is about whether we need new central entity, as you call it, to align this. I think that this is there is a risk in this, that we get a kind of central planning authority with which I think the majority of European member states has not made very good experiences. So I still think that we need to make this coordination, but ultimately keep these better aligned planning results let's say, in the coordination of the market, so that the market signals, the price signals, remain efficient and are not or prevail. Let's say prevail. Yeah, and part of this, I think, can certainly be injected in what you call the competition in the market. I think that that slide is very inducive by arranging better certain segments of the market, in particular the forward market. I think you mentioned this to integrate more the longer term trading, the longer term incentives that are necessary for the for investments in this part. So I think that I would still see it as a horizontal relationship rather than what you have in this tripartite system. And because otherwise, I think we are risking exactly the crowding out effects that you were mentioning, or the lack of liquidity or the reduction of liquidity in markets that are very often not very liquid anyhow. So I think I would rather try to strengthen the elements that we have now with the EMD 2024 to integrate this into the markets with a long-term segment, the forward markets, strengthening the forward markets with the instruments that are there. About, of course, let's say what you have there. But making sure that yes, all of these tools that you mentioned are well designed to not risk that the markets ultimately are not efficient any longer. Yeah, so I think this is something we need to see from the market perspective rather than from an inherent deficit of market. Yeah, so that is where I would say I differ with your starting point or with your analysis. I fully agree that more coordination is needed, that better planning is needed, more integrated planning, everything that you said. But the conclusion or the way to overcome this would, for me, not be in a sort of centralized entity, but rather strengthening the market mechanism to strengthen the longer term elements there. Maybe as a first thought, happy
Thanks.
to discuss, of course.
Yes, thanks. And I'll turn to Georg. You know, in your recent publications, you have mentioned a new institution, the European Independent System Operator, to plan certain elements of the European electricity system. So I'd be curious to get your perspective on the same topic, contrasting perhaps with some of Annegret's comments. So over to you.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for inviting me. It was really great work that Fabian and Charles have presented. Maybe, yeah, kind of trying to position myself a bit between Annegret and Fabian. Maybe my feeling is that indeed the market should do most of the investments, and I think Fabian agrees with that, in generation and on the demand side, and make sure that we have the right plants in the right location, in the right sequence of time, and the right so really the right technology. And it's a very, very complex thing that you can find will find very, very difficult to kind of do a planning on. And market actors are quite well positioned on that. And my feeling is that the idea that we had with utilities that have a sort of demand profile or portfolio and a supply portfolio and try to match that over time, and technologies, if they are really in European competition, if we have a sufficient number of them, can unleash a lot of the market force. But what I do not fully see is that we get kind of the guidance in terms of what the state is going to do, both in terms of network development, but also in terms of energy policy in a national setting, which then also spills over to neighboring countries. And here, my feeling would be that we need more consistent guidance to be able to kind of then do policies that are in line with our targets, so that if we feel we want a system with very, very high shares of renewables and a bit of hydrogen or gas as backup, then we need to have this vision somehow calculated and spelled out in a consistent European way, that not only market participants understands that this is the somehow politically desired direction, where you still have market signals that might show in a different direction, but then policymakers are potentially likely or able at some stage to change market signals, because that's what they are doing with their market design choices and decisions. So therefore, I think this guiding element of planning is somewhat needed. And the same holds for grid investments. That is somewhat a public planning exercise. That is one challenge, and would be happy to also have Annegret's view on that. But my sense is that currently our grid planning is not really based on maximizing European welfare, but it's based on minimizing the national system operators' cost. And this is far from being the same thing. And we need a more European approach here that really integrates European economic welfare in this analysis. And that's where I come in with this ISO idea. It will be very difficult to take the assets away from national TSOs. Member states would also like to keep a certain degree of kind of line of defense for their national sovereignty and for the system. But putting on top of that a system that manages and optimizes the dispatch of the plants in a more efficient way, which we can come to, but was maybe not the topic of today, and also comes up with a public projection of what grid build out is efficient, then approved by the regulator, and then the national TSOs have to build that. Seems to me like a more incentive compatible way to get to the right system.
Great, thank you. Annegret, would you like to respond to that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's a very good approach that you outlined, and I think they are not necessarily opposed. Maybe indeed let's say, currently operators are slow, let's say, in taking up the necessary grid expansion on the European level, or for the need. I wouldn't say European level, that's probably false, for the needs that we need for the internal market. So in other words, for cross-border interconnectors. I think that is where they are slow. But I also think with the TYNDP and also 10E projects, etc., we have the necessary tools, plus also bidding zone review, and also the elements about the 70%, whatever the percentage is, but the 70% and enforcing this, I think, would overcome this gap that you identified between, let's say, the needs on the European level in terms of capacity to really have the necessary grid for the cross-border trading, for the beneficial cross-border trading, and at the same time also the national let's say, minimization of system costs, because for me this somehow goes hand in hand, and maybe we just differ about the speed that is needed to push for the maximization of the European needs versus prioritizing, minimizing national system needs. Yeah, so I think that it's more a matter of how speedily can we, as regulators, enforce the implementation of these elements. I would say the elements, we have the elements with the EMD, with the 2019 provisions, and now reinforced, I would say, also on the with the 2024 EMD, additional EMD provisions there. So I'm a bit hesitant to. And that is a more general statement now, and happy again to discuss that European Commission already starts thinking introducing additional instruments before we even have implemented the 2024 instruments. And I think that is something where we should probably say, let's implement them more speedily. I would agree. And then let's see how they work out before we start thinking about reforming again and introducing new instruments. Yeah, I think there is a little bit of an actionism currently with all the grid action plan initiatives, etc. While I think we have the instruments, we need to apply them and we need to enforce them.
Can I
Georg,
jump
I see
in?
your hand up, but Fabian, yeah, if you want to briefly jump in.
Yeah, sorry, Georg. So a couple of points to clarify, perhaps, our thinking with Charles. The fact that we coordinate and strengthen the coordination and planning does not mean that we support central planning. Quite the contrary. So I want to, maybe there was a misunderstanding. I think I want to distinguish quite clearly the two things. We still believe that there should be a set of, diversified mechanisms leading to assessing what we call the system needs, and that these need to be better coordinated. But this is quite far from implying that we actually suggest a comeback to central planning, not at all. But we think that we need an alignment between the policies that we set for ourselves through the targets for clean technologies, for emissions, for security of supply, and what that means for the markets. And that information needs to be provided in a much more structured way in terms of what we need. And the last slide, maybe that's what I cause confusion and agreed, is not a slide about planning. That's a slide about contracting. And again, the idea is not that there is a third-party entity that centrally contracts with the other ones, not at all. It's the idea that you have that already. If you look at CFDs, for instance, there is a state counterparty, but often there is a caveat in the CFDs that can lead to a PPA with a private offtaker. So we have many ways in which you can enhance the functioning of the market and private arrangements by having a role for the state to take some of the risks. And we see that multiplying in many countries without a common framework. So this is already happening. But I don't think we are fully equipped yet at EU level to have best practices on that front. And that's what we try to do in the report. So I hope that clarifies. Sorry.
Thanks, Fabian. Yeah, especially on also harmonizing simple sensitivities and scenarios or inputs in some of the planning across, not to say that certain unit has to have the same cost in different member states, but at least harmonizing in how those inputs are developed, I think could also be an interesting and a higher level harmonization. Georg, you had your hand up before. Would you like to jump in?
Yes. No, I mean, maybe picking up then on your point here. I mean, my feeling is that a lot of the planning exercises are essentially things that are public policy to me. So it's something that, in my view, is going to be a central node in the kind of democratic information and understanding what we want to do, and negotiating and discussing that. And I have the feeling that in the current system centered around ENTSO-E, which is a representation of one market actor, it is not straightforward to argue that they would essentially have the interest to come up with the most transparent, most societally efficient plan to be scrutinized then by everybody, that kind of policymakers would like to build their policies on, and investors want to build their investments on. So that is. I know that this is the system we have now. They are kind of the most neutral actor that we have on that. But I am, if I see the system development plans from some countries, including my country, Germany, I mean, they are, and if people try to replicate them, there has been a replication study for the German one that says it's possible to reduce the cost by 30 or 40%. Of the system development plan to get essentially the same capabilities in the system. And I cannot entirely judge that, because not all of this data is available, and would be interesting to hear again from Annegret whether she thinks that regulators are up to speed to be able to scrutinize what TSOs are presenting to them. But my feeling as an outside observer would be I am not. I mean, we try to dive into these scenarios. We try to understand what is happening, and it's not possible. It's simply it's not enough documented, it's not enough transparent, it's not enough data being made available, and the discussions are then on very technical side or kind of specific issues. But on the big picture, I think we could get to better plans by having more open, transparent modeling here being made available and discussed on a kind of on the marketplace of ideas.
Thanks. So in the last 8 minutes that we have, I'd like to shift a little bit towards that middle topic, which is procurement, and we can add contracting as well. So we already started to discuss this a little bit, but I'd be curious, Annegret, to get your perspective, if you see a role for either a public entity or some auction mechanisms to start helping incentivize proactive procurement, either where there is a gap between targets and where the market is going, or also to incentivize new generation and storage that allows clean energy to be delivered when the sun isn't shining and when the wind isn't blowing. I think we've seen a lot of volatility in the European markets in the last several years. So is there room for any sort of hybridization effectively on the procurement side of things to help move us forward?
Yeah, I think we are centering again around the main point when and the term hybrid, I have some doubts about it, is still how do we make sure that in the end these elements are, let's say, complementary, and that's what I understand, and let's say adding structurally to what the market is coordinating, or is trading, and where do we get a sort of a kind of overkill substituting efficient market signals. So I would definitely not say that we need another entity there. With what I agree, and I understand, Fabian, what you are saying, that there are already, let's say, for CFDs or others, state-backed instruments where risks are taken, and clearly this is the function of CFDs. If you are arguing, or if you are, let's say, implying that this should also be more the case for PPAs, I have some doubts about this, because we also recently you saw that ACER, and we discussed this, of course, within the Board of Regulators, expressed that there's no need for a standardization of PPAs. because by nature we would say that PPAs are rather specific or bilateral, satisfying bilateral needs. Yeah. So if you want to, let's say, enhance the use of PPAs, I guess one thing might be to try to get the threshold of when you can enter into these type of engagements with some sort of minimum size, or some on the other side then saying you can contract as a community or whatever, so that then you can probably enlarge this market segment if you like. But I would not say that we need a central entity or an entity as such on the PPA side. Yeah, there I think it. I wouldn't necessarily see a benefit. I rather would argue again to make sure that the forward markets are properly regulated, and we are in the process of FCA 2.0, etc. So the network codes. So that this market comes close and is in, let's say, these are complementary then with PPA trading.
Thanks.
Probably I wasn't clear enough, but that would be my my response.
Noted. No, thank you. And Georg, over to you, perhaps for the last word today. I'd be curious to get your perspective on the evolving incentives for pushing 24/7 clean electricity delivery. We've had the introduction of flexibility markets that are still being implemented and designed. Capacity remuneration mechanisms were mentioned significantly on this call. So I'd be curious to get your perspective on the market design front. What additional steps could be taken here?
For last word, I might be a bit too provocative on that one, but I have the feeling that we do not necessarily need any specific rules on 24/7 carbon-free electricity provision, because in principle we have an emission trading system, and it's going to substantially tighten over the next years. And on the carbon side, a lot of that will be delivered. And if you put obligations on individual consumers to organize contracts that are 24/7 carbon-free, they are going to find this electricity somewhere in Europe and put it together. But the additionality from this for the rest of the market will be close to zero. So it will be a good job for consultants and accountants, but it's not necessarily providing any value added for the system. In my view, it's just making things more complicated. But I probably think that's not a good end statement. So maybe somebody else want to comment on that.
Well, perhaps Fabienne, I'll turn it back to you on this topic. Where do you see potential improvements on the market design front? And noting we only have 1 minute left.
Yeah, no, I'll be super quick. You remember my second slide where I said there is this super important part which is improving the energy market, and I think I fully subscribe to Annegret's point, which is we should be careful that these other building blocks are not undermining the efficient functioning of the market. So I think it is very important to stress that better planning and contracting mechanisms cannot be a substitute for a well-working market in the first place. So if you ask me a concluding word, I would make sure that there is no ambiguity on our meaning. Yes, it is meant to be complementary, and there are a lot of detailed design issues to ensure that. But markets should remain, of course, the backbone of it.
Well, thank you for those concluding words, and thank you all for joining us. This report is now public and has been shared via a link in the chat. So please go out and take a read and enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you, everyone.